Hey everyone, has AI killed the innovation star? You're watching Techstrong, gang. Hi everyone, happy Friday. It's Alan Shimel and welcome to another Techstrong, gang. We've got some good stuff to talk about today to start your weekend off bright and cheery or down and depressed, either way. But nevertheless, the weekend's coming. We got our great Friday panel to talk about it on. Fridays really are our best panel of the week usually. And a lot of it is because of these folks right here. Joining us from, it looks like a subway brick background, probably in New York. Ira Winkler, going across to the other side of the country, probably up near Seattle, our good friend Fred Wilmot. And it looks like she's home in Colorado, the one and only Camberley Bates. And of course, high up in his attic in Harrison, New York, Mike Vizard.
Which is rapidly becoming the People's Republic of New York. So there you go.
The People's Republic of New York. Well, that would be the city. You're kind of...
Hey, we were the People's Republic of Boulder a long time ago. So.
Yeah, you were. I remember when I first started coming to Boulder in 2001. It was very much the People's Republic. Anyway, gang, it's Friday, but there's just big things happening in our world beyond the election this past week and some of the results there. Mike, why don't you kick us off here?
Well, it seems like the tech leaders are all calling for innovation once again that happens to spend a lot of money, this time in digital health sector. But you have a post suggesting that maybe they should heal their own issues first before we get too far into other people's problems. But you wrote this piece. I think you're spot on, but walk us through it.
All right. Well, and by the way, the piece is up on Techstrong IT. It's called Tech Heal Thyself. And I also I talked about it on my Shimmy Says episode this past Thursday, which by today you'll be able to see on YouTube and everywhere else. It really grew out of a book review on a New York Times article. The book was written by a former, I think it was a Biden administration antitrust person, and I know they're not in favor these days, but basically he was lamenting that we need the government to kind of step in here and stop this oligarchy of big tech vendors monopolizing AI, and while we're at it, throw in robotics and quantum and everything else. And the real issue is this AI revolution that we're seeing has become such a big boys game. The bar to entry is measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, not even the hundreds of millions, right? To play in this, you've got, circular things where, Microsoft gives OpenAI a couple of $100 billion. OpenAI buys a couple of $100 billion worth of Azure services. The same thing goes on with Oracle and AWS and Anthropic and Meta and Google. And they're all just kind of passing the salami around here, hide the salami, playing with this money. But if you don't have that kind of dough, if you don't have that kind of gravitas, how do you compete? How do you play in this market? One of the great things about tech, I said it before, I'll say it again, is that you could get two guys in a garage. They could reinvent an industry or launch a new segment of industry and make untold riches, whether it was Woz and Jobs or Sergey and Larry or whoever, Bill Gates and Paul Allen or whoever. We've always been, that's been the promise of tech, is that the little guy can become the next giant.
Yeah, Alan, I'm going to disagree with you if I could.
Go ahead.
And let me tell you why. Because what these people are doing is very specific to creating the infrastructure. In many ways, it's kind of like saying, oh my God, I was cut out of the telephone system because I can't put together my own I can't put together my own lines and cables and everything. And I think that that's the more critical aspect of this, that what they are doing is enabling other people and smaller people to use, and I hate the term AI, but they're allowing people to use AI related technologies and providing the infrastructure required for people to develop and deploy their own models. Not that they are, locking other people out. And I think that's a
So Ira,
difference.
let's go. Yeah, Ira, let's go back to the .com. It was very similar, right? You had AT&T, the original AT&T before it got broken up, right? Ma Bell, and they broke that up, and you had the CLET, but it wasn't just a handful of companies that controlled all the fiber, that controlled all the data centers. You had the CLEX and the ILEX and all of these other carriers, if you remember those words, right? Who could bring connectivity to your office or your house or what have you. Anybody could open up their own. How many little ISPs were started? Some became big, some didn't. How anybody could be a hosting provider and open a data center. It wasn't measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. You didn't have the government with their thumb on the scale owning equity in these companies.
So not to get on the government side, but Alan, I think, and I'm going to agree a bit with Ira about what he's saying, is that this is the level of infrastructure that's being put in place, because none of this matters, in my view, until it executes on a use case out in the wild. And then I have the ability as a company, as a user, to go look at, let's say there's 5 LLMs out there. There's usually only, the rule of 3 is usually there's only 3 big companies that will have that big infrastructure. And, going back to Jack Welch, if you want 1, 2, or 3, I'm jettisoning you. And so where we're now at is that they're building this, and we actually need them to be this strong, because if we're going to keep ahead of China, which is a fully government institutionalized LLM system, we need the strength of these very large companies to keep on that, stay on the edge, and that money behind it. And then
let me get this straight, Camberley. You're using a Red Scare to
No, I'm not
justify
using
it?
I'm not using just the Red Scare. I'm saying that my biggest worry about where we are on the AI bubble is whether or not this is going to actually, all this investment in these huge LLMs is going to end up in use cases that we are actually using it. Because until it goes to use cases, that infrastructure is of no value. That's kind of like, what Sun and Cisco did and everything else in 1999 and 2000, where they were just shipping gear constantly. And this is like shipping gear. And until companies delivered on an internet application, and it wasn't pets.com, it was the real applications that got out there, there was a stability in that internet and how it was being used. I see that we're in the same place here with the AI. And so I'm very anxiously looking at the end users to see, how are they using this technology? Where is this going? Because that's where the real big value is going to be.
I think there's a couple of important points there, Camberley. I like around the story that, Alan, let's use your analogy. So these big companies are laying the fiber, right? Deep sea fiber across transcontinental fiber, these types of things. But until somebody is going to be able to weaponize that, it's akin to the same problem of the last mile bottleneck, to get into your ILEC conversation, right? And so when we think about what that means, the use case that Camberley is talking about here is the last mile bottleneck. Why did we have to figure out how to solve a last mile bottleneck with, plain old telephone POTS lines, right? Because bandwidth demanded it, because applications that demanded that bandwidth demanded it. And in this particular case, and we're building the fiber lines for all of the telecom model across the US and the globe, and these data centers are a part of that fabric for the purpose of being exposed in that way. I think the use case, the last mile bottleneck, is absolutely the rationale behind the innovation. And it's also cyclical. We've seen this before where, at first we thought everything should be centralized, and then we thought everything should be decentralized, right? 3270 terminals and, frame relay circuits and all these things. And then all of a sudden, right, we have this very decentralized way of doing things, but it creates a whole set of issues around how to manage the economy at scale. So we get, monolith behavior again. It's cyclical. I think we're in that. You're right to frame it up as we're in this process of aggregation and maybe extraction, but I think the value proposition is what happens as a result of that, which we don't see yet.
I have one concern, and it comes down to price. And to your point, Camberley, I'll use your cloud example to prove the opposite. So I have 5 big providers of LLMs, and right now, to be honest, they are subsidizing the cost of AI, and they're charging people less than it is for them to actually produce that thing. And eventually they'll run out of VC money and start charging people what it's going to really cost. I have noticed this interesting trend over the years. We had 3 big providers of virtual machines, and you know what? Amazingly, the cost of virtual machines never changed. No matter how much alleged competition there was, it was always the same. I think the same thing's going to play out here. I think a big number of companies are going to own access to these GPUs and their LLMs, and people are going to be like, hey, suddenly I'm getting gouged on pricing and I got nowhere else to go, unless I go build smaller models and get my own systems and put my own LLMs over there, and then I'm not going to be hostage to these guys. That's what I think.
And I would agree with you, Mike, on that. I do that. This is a very fair point in terms of pricing, et cetera. And I also agree with you in the smaller models of seeing these, we have the very large models, and then we have the unique models that are going to be by each industry. We haven't quite gotten there yet. I mean, we're starting to see a few of those coming out. And as those do come out, yes, that will drive, drive innovation that's out there.
Sorry, I also think this whole pricing model around tokens is just flat out crazy. A token is an input and an output. And if you're going to pay for every input and output, you're going to wind up spending a fortune. So there's got to be a better way.
But so here, there does have to be a better way, Mike. But the problem is when you anoint these companies as too big to fail, and the government, takes off the referee's striped shirt and puts on the team jersey, right? You don't open up to allow a better way to happen, right? For all intents and purposes, what we're building in the US model is a Cadillac, right? It's a very expensive, very heavy, these big LLMs. It may not be, it may prove that it may not be the best way to do this, right? When the Chinese DeepSeek thing came out, it struck fear in the hearts of the US AI industry like nothing we've seen since Sputnik, had Werner Braun up all night. But that's healthy. That's what a healthy market does. People innovate. They come out with new ideas, with better ways. They out-innovate. They out-nimble the behemoths, the big guys. But what I'm saying is this time, the big guy's advantage is so ingrained. We're not looking to the government for antitrust. Who expects that? But I am looking for a level playing field. I am looking to give the little guys a shot to out-innovate here and come to market. I'm worried that we're not going to allow these people to come to market because the decks are so stacked. They've built the barriers so high.
So who can assist in this? I mean, we're talking about VC investment in some other models, but they are overly tied into the success of these companies. I mean, if you listen to the guys that are,
Sure are.
They are, they are tied in those companies making it as big as they are, and frankly, so is a lot of our investments in the in in the stock market.
No, let's face it. The AI economy is responsible
Yes.
for the majority of the GDP growth in the US this year, right? So, and it's tied into 7 companies. It's not, or 8 companies. It's not healthy. Now, but I'm glad you asked the question, Kimberly. I'll turn you back to Jurassic Park, where Jeff Goldblum says, life will find a way. And I firmly believe that innovation will find a way. It may not come from Silicon Valley because they're too wrapped into this. It may, unfortunately, I'm hoping it doesn't come from Beijing or Bangalore or Moscow or somewhere like that. But maybe it comes in Austin or Boulder. Maybe it comes in Raleigh. Maybe it has to come from, but it will come. It's going to come from, you can't bottle that up, right? I'll give you another analogy. Star Trek world, right? The warp drive. I mean, humanity appears to have been in the crapper, and some weird dude up in Idaho, Zephyrin Pike.
Can I give you a real world example? It's called the oil industry. And how many years did they invest in finding ways to make sure that there were no alternative forms of energy invested in? And how many times did they just buy something up and just tuck it away somewhere? And that was
Another great.
We could do that all over again.
That we might be dealing with that all over again. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
But life will. I am optimistic. Life will find a way that innovation will succeed, and it'll probably be in somebody's garage somewhere.
And I am too, because if you look at all the different industries, you've been involved with, I've been involved with, yes, we've seen is kind of like in my world when I was, running in the data storage site, EMC was the big guy and they kept on buying, but there was very little innovation coming out of them. They bought Data Domain, they bought Isilon, and several others that became huge offerings into the market. And we saw the same with IBM and others. And then we've got companies like Pure Storage that came out of investment and Vast Data. Both of them are challenging the entire market as we've gone into new application areas. It's because of the new applications that have driven those innovations and not the old stuff. So I think that, yes, we will see the innovation. And I, applaud article, Alan, that you wrote that was really, really super good. I would encourage everybody to go and read it. I put it up on my LinkedIn, so go check it out. You'll find it there.
Are we gonna remake Network, and are you gonna scream out the window like I'm not taking it anymore? How far are we going with this?
It wouldn't be the first time I screamed out my window, but anyway, you know what, Camberley, thanks for the plug. The article is up there. You can watch the Shimmy Says. I'll go dig deeper on that. But we've got more to talk about here on the gang. So let's take a break. We're going to come back. I think Ira is going to kick off our next one here. You're watching Techstrong, gang.
You've earned it. The spotlight, the responsibility, the weight of teams, companies, and entire industries fall on your shoulders. Lives depend on your decisions, your home life included. At work, you're protected, physically and digitally. Nothing gets through your team without a fight. But in a globally connected world, everyone sees you, including those who mean to cause you and your organization harm. And now home, your sanctuary. Attackers see an opportunity. Your digital front door is wide open. And what compromises your home can breach your boardroom. Because the devil's greatest trick isn't targeting your workplace firewall. It's convincing you that your personal life isn't at risk. Black Cloak. Digital executive protection, defending the new attack surface. Your personal life.
Hey folks, we're back and we're talking now about, law and privacy and security and all kinds of fun things. But there's an article up on Security Boulevard by Mark Rash that talks about, one of the reasons we don't have privacy regulations maybe is that there isn't enough lawsuits out there because, well, the way we frame these legal standing issues results in people not being able to sue. But Ira, you're a lot closer to this than I am. What's your take here? And, is this a conspiracy or is this just something we overlooked all these years and we need to fix?
So let me be upfront. I've been an expert witness on a variety of class action lawsuits, mostly around privacy, Fair Credit Reporting Act, and things like that. And when you look at these lawsuits, you have class action attorneys essentially crawling out of the sewers and essentially finding cases where they can apply the Fair Credit Reporting Act or another law that has statutory that has statutory claims. For example, every violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act is a mandatory $100 penalty. Now, sounds not like much, but if there's 1 million people, that's almost sudden $100 million lawsuit. And when you are looking at these things, frankly, there are companies that do major wrong, and if they're at fault, they should be held accountable. However, the current class action framework doesn't necessarily benefit the consumers at the end of the day. The way it theoretically benefits the consumers in the eyes of these class action attorneys is that they are bringing a lawsuit to hold these people accountable so that they are better in the future. And they believe that they deserve tens of millions of dollars for their efforts of filing paperwork. And at the same time, the people who are actually wronged get nothing. There was actually a class action lawsuit where some attorney sued Google. They got like $10 million in fees, while the people who were aggrieved got nothing. Literally nothing. That was the lawsuit because they made the situation better. Now, when these laws, from what I read, the article was highlighting how very specifically attorneys are out there and they have to actually show people were damaged. In other words, they have to actually show that somebody's information was stolen, which is one thing, but that the information was used or abused, which is another thing. Because I could download 100 million records and not be able to go through and process it unless you can prove it was put up on some malicious website or used in some way, shape, or form. In theory, the people, according to the court decisions, were not harmed in any way. And so that might be true. At the same time, what's really the problem, in my opinion, is how are the penalties being enacted? Who are the people actually benefiting? Which is a real question we should be asking, because at the end of the day, class action attorneys walk away with tens of millions of dollars, and I'm not exaggerating, while the people who are harmed get very little. For example, when there was a class action against dog food companies where they had killed dogs because of poisoned dog food, which is rightfully, I own a dog and boy, would I want somebody to pay for that. The people who had their dog die or get harmed, they were given a coupon for free dog food while the attorneys walked away with tens of millions of dollars. And at the same time, was anything changed? I would argue no. I don't think whoever the company was, whether it was Purina or whoever, I don't know, the company, they don't want to kill dogs. It's bad for their image. So did the lawsuit do any good except getting people who had to buy a new dog a bag of dog food? No. And this is the environment we're in. And now taking a step back and saying, unless you're actually harmed, you can't be put into a class. And the people put into a class just inflate the numbers. It inflates the potential threat the lawyers hold over the companies, but it's not benefiting the consumers. So while believe me, I want companies who do wrong and undervalue security to theoretically be punished and held accountable, but the current class action environment is not the way to do it.
All right.
I'll leave it there.
Alan, you've been a lawyer in the past, and I think what Ira's now campaigning for, I don't know what office exactly, but Tort reform. Is that what we need here?
Well, yeah, that is what he's campaigning for. But in law, we have this theory of what we call judicial restraint, judicial economy. Judges don't like to make decisions unless they have to. Lawyers don't like to write opinions unless they're really getting paid for it. And if you look at Mark Rash's article that this segment is based on, it's typical judicial economy, right? And lawyer restraint. What they're fundamentally saying is we don't need tort reform. We don't need tort reform. The cases or the theoretical cases, I assume he's changed the name to protect the innocent here. There is no elephant insurance company. But what he's saying is the court has said there's a difference between could be potentially harmed versus being actually harmed, right? The fact that your social security number might be available on the dark web, or your driver's license number, your date of birth, some PII, might be available on the dark web, is not a nexus to damage. You haven't actually suffered any damages yet. We have to wait till you can prove that as a result of your PII being on the dark web or being used in a nefarious way, you've suffered real damages. And until you've suffered real damages, you don't have standing to bring a lawsuit. So you can't be part of that class action, right? In essence, it's going to kill off the class actions and limit it to only people who have actually suffered real harm. So in and of itself, it's almost tort reform, right? Because it's changing from, hey, my PII was stolen, I could be at risk here, and therefore I'm suing you. And what Mark says is, no, the remedy is going to be, hey, I'll give you some credit monitoring, but until you got real damages, take a walk.
Alan, the other thing this talk tells me is like they separate, the article in Mark separates personal information or private information from personal information. Private information is your HIPAA, your personal life about how you and your spouse are talking or something. And from understanding we are responsible individually, we should be responsible for our information. And knowing that once you put the information out there, the probability that it's on the dark web is really high. And so therefore it's like, okay, we need to, as individuals, be wary about all those kind of phishing, things that come across your email, the bizarre stuff that we happen. And so I hear, holding the companies accountable, but I also hear that we have to hold ourselves accountable for our private information and be judicious with what we do and how we monitor that data.
Just one sec. I think it's unreasonable expectations for the burden of proof for managing my information that I have given through consent for the use of a specific company is on me to validate it won't be used against me at some years following. And I'll give an example. Knowing where I went to high school, knowing where I went to elementary school, I don't care. Public basis, you can go find that information anywhere. Being able to build an umbrella identity off of all of my information, that's identifiable information, but personal information, not personal facts, is something that no person can predict the likely outcome of what happens when this happens. Imagine elderly folks that have, their entire lives tied up in 401ks and IRAs and so on and so forth, an account takeover adjacent to that because their data has been exposed and they don't really use the internet, right? Suddenly puts them in crisis where hundreds of millions of dollars of folks that are over the age of 70, right, are now at risk, and they have the burden of proof required for them to justify whether or not that's causing harm. I think it's incredible to suggest, and I think there has to be accountability, and you don't get to bump that to me just because I should be a, Consumer Reports, person that understands the likelihood and the possibilities, right? That is that is a type of irrevocable trust that you put into a company's hands that you can't possibly sign away.
Well, I actually started out, and I want to be very clear. I 100% agree with Fred, because there is a difference in having your information theoretically available to a criminal versus putting it in criminal forums like the dark web. So, for example, if you just say, gee, some criminal had access to, what's a recent one? The Marriott database. Some criminal had access to it, and therefore, who knows what they could have done. And I'm going to have like a gazillion class members, so I can charge you $100 times a gazillion. That's one thing. However, if that information ended up in the dark web, where it's hard to prove that somebody did or didn't, you have to act like they did. And that's where I differ from what they were saying in principle to the specifics. And again, I agree with the line that Fred is drawing.
So can we just automate this a little bit and say, okay, I should be able to discover on the dark web when people have been harmed. I should be able to create a website that aggregates all that information, and then I should be able to invite people to participate in my class action suit because I can prove they've been harmed. And yeah, this is just a business process workflow.
I say no. Over what period of time and with what magnitude and what adjacency, right? So Fred Wilmot, right? Or my grandfather's name, Francis Wilmot, right? The ability to stack identities together in a way that's meaningful with personal information is a very, very robust way of stealing people's identities. And when that information has been given out, right, then you're now subject to, there are no rules that stipulate these artificial identities cause harm to the originating identity. But you can build up credit card profiles, you can buy houses, you can do any number of other things. And there's no way to materially suggest that is directly tied to the consumer who was exploited until somebody comes knocking on the door and saying, oh, well, you know what? We tracked all this back all the way to you somehow. And it's up to the burden of proof is on the human who stands there, whose identity was exploited. They had no idea about. And suddenly they're called to account.
So, Fred, I think what you're saying is that you're finding that these companies should be held accountable and having to pay these fees. And okay, yes, the trust system, how we do tort right now, and the fact that the lawyers skip away with 90% of the money or whatever it is, and the people that are harmed get very, very little, is not of consequence as it is with having the threat of the company being sued being the consequence, and then buttoning everything down.
Exactly.
And that's where the bigger value is that the companies have that threat. They know they need to do something differently, despite the fact that the only people that are really benefiting from these torts are the lawyers.
Yeah, Camberley, exactly. The bottom line is you should fear Tron, the user, not the class action lawsuit. And in this particular case, if you're accountable to the user or whomever, right, that's the real impetus. Go ahead, Ira.
No, I was just going to conclude. I frankly agree in large extent, and I'm just trying to go ahead and say, look, you have to understand, because a lot of people say there's a class action lawsuit, go get them, not realizing it's really just a transfer of wealth from the company to a lawyer, not getting, retribution, or I shouldn't say retribution, but compensation to the aggrieved parties. And that has to change. Like, again, it's just like a total, because I don't think any attorneys really care. At the end of the day, let's face it. And here's the elephants in the elephant's room. Fundamentally, this is all covered by insurance. It's the insurance people who are paying for this. It's not the companies who are paying. They just hire other attorneys to deal with it. The insurance companies bump up the premiums of everybody, and we all end up paying for it. And people don't realize the ecosystem of
It's
what's
not
going
just the
on.
insurance, Ira. Let me make this real for us. Let me make it real for us. Recently came across a case, all too personally, of one of these West Hollywood, California law firms sending out a Xeroxed copy of a letter stating that a website has some data broker service in there, and they claim they have a person who came to the website and was therefore harmed by having her information exposed to data brokers. And pursuant to the U.S. wiretapping law and the California Privacy Act, they're going to start a class action lawsuit unless you pay them $10,000. 10 grand. 10 grand don't sound like a lot of money, but remember, there's a reason why they're sending out Xerox copies of this letter. They're probably sending them out by the dozen. Lawyers, you hire a lawyer to go look into it. Absolute nonsense. You have your T's and C's in place. You have your cookie warnings. You have everything you're supposed to have. We could fight this thing. We got to make a motion to dismiss. $15,000. $15,000 for the motion to dismiss. Now you're a businessman. Do you pay the 10 grand to put the troll back in the box? Or do you go 15 grand on your principles? And that motion's not guaranteed to win, by the way, right? Because they don't like doing summary judgment. Courts don't like granting summary judgment. If we got to do discovery, it's 25, 35 grand to just keep playing. That's the problem in the law system here. That's where we need tort reform. And it is. It's the lawyers, right? There's a reason I stopped doing law. I hate these lawyers, these trolls. They are making a bet, and I spoke to a lawyer about it. They don't go after large companies who don't mind, who have lawyers on staff and will fight them till the cows come home. They go after small, medium companies who, in a business decision, will pay the 10 grand versus fighting it out for 25 or 50 grand and ultimately winning. That's where the system's broke. And that's what we need to fix.
Mm-hmm.
I'll step down off my soapbox now.
I think we're supposed to say amen and end the session here.
We'll end it right here. You're watching Techstrong, gang.
Discover Techstrong Group, the epicenter of tech innovation. We're your go-to for reaching IT leaders and practitioners worldwide. Our secret? Impactful content that sparks awareness, engagement, and top-quality leads. With us, you'll access editorial websites, streaming videos, virtual events, custom content, analyst research, and more. Join our satisfied clients. Let's revolutionize your tech journey. Contact us today and tell your story to the world in the most powerful way with Techstrong Group.
Hey folks, we're back with our last block, and we're talking about the acquisition of Stitch by a company called Twilio. And some people are heralding this as an advance in how we're going to manage identities because it'll make it easier for developers. And other people are saying, well, it's an episode of Twilio and Stitch, and maybe it's just going to be one more cartoon. Fred, you looked at all of this stuff. What's your take on what's going on here? And are we going to see more of this?
I love it. And also the subtle nod to Lilo and Stitch. I'll say it outright. Remember when you used to have to pay your HR company for SSO as a special feature? Remember when people said, oh, you know what? Passwords are terrible. Everything should be passwordless. Or, hey, you know what? I have this amazing SAML token. You can just connect up into your things and life will be good. Well, it turns out all of those have both a cost and a complexity and, a challenge, and they're designed for people. They weren't designed for non-human identities. And so what we're seeing here is a movement, right, that's begun to say, hey, look, standardization is a requirement. Your JOT tokens for your web session have to use an actual standard. You can't poorly implement, HTTP like we have in the past in a way that suggests that auth is a function of that. And that coincides with things like proprietary SDKs and, non-standardized delegated authentication mechanisms. And for the uninitiated, what that means is I want to connect up with my Google identity to the things that I use. Okay, well, there's a standard utilized there called OIDC that allows you to decide that the same constructs or the same, scope and the same entitlements are things that I can pass from place to place. It's a unified way of doing this method of authentication and the method of authorization. So is this revolutionary? I don't think it's revolutionary, but I think what's happening here is there's a whole host of new cohorts that are looking at this in an entirely different fashion, that are accounting for non-human identities, which demand, without human interaction, demand standards in order to operate. So you can imagine that, historically we've had folks like Auth0, a staple in the industry, not without their own security concerns over the last handful of years from exploitation. But in addition to that, other providers that have non-traditional methods or historical methods for authentication, one of which, at least when I was the CISO at JumpCloud, right, terrific identity provider, right, had to support SCIM in the implementations of the providers in which that SCIM was designed, right? So they'd have to copy the directory from somebody else in this particular case. And what we're doing is we're taking the insecurities with us as we go based on the implementation of said provider. So identity providers now are starting to move past this construct and suggesting, hey, look, there's a lot of B2B platforms, a lot of SaaS platforms, a lot of requirements for us to tie into, MCP servers. And so those requirements illustrate why it's more likely to have competitive, APIs and ways of integrating with standards based authentication methods. And I think it's terrific. Do I think this particular acquisition is a harbinger of the entirety of change in the industry? No, but it's certainly a big one, right? And if there was a shot across the bow for an Auth0, I would probably be taking notes today.
Alan, what's your take here? Do we need to just make this easier for developers in the first place, and then we wouldn't have all this crap on the back end that Fred's talking about?
We've tried to make it easier. Like you look at like SendGrid, which isn't that part of Twilio too, Fred, right? Didn't they buy SendGrid? So SendGrid was great. If you wanted to have sort of an email verification or something like that kick off in your app, you could just, you put a little SendGrid component in there, and on the back end, SendGrid took care of all that. And it really helped with spam filtering and getting blackboxed and all these things. It's an interesting thing. Like I've always had the opinion of, why does someone want to spam mail? Why do we need passwords? Why do we need all of this whole huge infrastructure we've all developed over, whether it's single sign-on, federated identity? It all really comes down to identity, doesn't it? Right? It's identity and access management. And, in the age of cloud, that became the killer app for cloud security in many ways, right? I got to know who you are and where you're allowed to go. We had 8021X when I was doing NAC, right? It was a big thing, Fred, if you remember those days, right? We've never saw. Here we are. It's 2025, going to 2026. We're still talking about the same crap. We're still talking about the same crap. We haven't solved it.
So Camberley, your take on this, because I think we've reached a point where maybe the same crap is no longer sustainable. Because if I miss my guess, and I think Fred mentioned non-human identities, so now we're going to have these AI agents, and there might be 100 AI agents for every human by the time we're done. So the current system just isn't going to be able to cope with that.
Yeah, as I'm listening to this, because you guys know this space, I know about that much in it, but I think it was last December when I was was at the American Society for AI. We had a debate on whether or not AI was a person or not, and it was a fascinating. I mean, it was one of those classic debates where you had one group that had to get up there and defend it, and the other one, to take it down. And by the time you're done, it's like you broadened your scope of thinking about how to look at these AI machines, and that when we get into MCP and you get into agents and everything else talking to each other, my my big thing is like, okay, I got this LLM or this agent over here saying one thing, I got another one over here. What if they evolve and they go around the security protection that we have? I mean, I'm laughing about it, but I'm like going, this is real stuff, And yes, we're starting again because we've just inserted a new person into this world of ours that we haven't had before. And that person is called AI or agents or whatever it is. And it's got we are handing over the keys to these guys. See, I'm actually calling it a person name. We're handing it over to this code and we're giving it names, for crying out loud. And when you and I interact with ChatGPT, you can't help but getting sucked in to the fact that you're talking to somebody. So yeah, we have to reinvent because we have all this brand new technology. And I hope that Fred, you and your team people out there that are developing all this stuff are smart enough to protect us because it's a really wild, wild west situation, I think.
It's a super good point. I like a couple of things about what you said that really focus on how we need to think about the next set of relationships that we develop, whether we consider, non-human identities, human identities or not. The focus here is really when we think about building infrastructure, for example, right? We have a bunch of agentic things and, we have a bunch of MCP tool chain and all the things that go with it, right? When we look at all of those components, separate and aside from anybody communicating with anything that we do outside of our business, and I believe a lot of other folks are in the same boat, we need to make sure that those are authentic and authorized behaviors that happen. And so, there's a couple of, if you read this article, right, there's a bunch of different listed available open source technologies. Well, I don't want to pay somebody else for n number of users, non-human identities that I use either, right? So, and I need to have a source of truth and I need to have an identity broker as well as an access control methodology, authorization, authentication that supports the standards, because at some time later, I also want to make sure I can interact with other folks that have, support of those standards. And so when we think about it, at least from a microcosm of a, tiny startup and a, ragtag fugitive fleet of folks building stuff like this in this market today, they've got to start somewhere that does not include these giant, arbiters of brokered identity trust, because it costs too much money to do it. So, and the complexity is, is rigorous. So when you go tie into, a very large organization that supports only a Microsoft identity or a Google identity or what have you, you probably need to know how to deal with that. And where do you start? You start with the tools that make it easiest. And so some of those may be Keycloak or, Fusion Auth is great for folks that do, devices, right? If you were interested in managing, 1,000 consoles in your retail locations, terrific for that. If you look at Dscope to make all of your automated flows better, there's all kinds of tools that are coming out to help enable that as a developer to supplant the sort of historical, cost model of the Ma Bell of identity.
Somebody tried to make me feel better about this because they told me that the AI agent would inherit my permissions. And I was like, well, given the fact that my permissions are not very well managed, I was even more terrified than I was before.
So it was the report this week was Amazon was yelling at Perplexity because Perplexity was placing orders on Amazon. So there's a battle going on between them. And I think about that. Okay, so Perplexity, based upon me getting in there, I haven't used it, but from what I understand, looking in there, and it can go on and go take my order and go to Amazon, search for the right thing to buy from me, and go buy whatever I'm wanting and ship it to me. That to me, and well, let's go back to our B block that we talked about, is scary, because all of a sudden my data is being passed between these two different companies that are not financial institutions. Thank you very much. You know, they're retail and whatever, but it's anyway, my brain can go all kinds of places. So I'll shut it down right now.
Let me just, it's not just about this isn't just about personal liability or personal harm. This, especially when you talk about machine identities and, is replacing phishing as a very easy way in to the corporation's infrastructure that then do ransomware or inject malware or what have you. And, we live in a world where the machine identities outweigh human identities by an exponential factor. And this problem's not going away. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to solve it here today either. So I need to pull the plug on this one. Camberley, Fred, Ira had to leave early, but we thank him. And Mike, as always, you. Hope you've enjoyed this. We've got more Techstrong TV as usual following up. But you know what? At the end of the day, have a great weekend, everyone. We're coming up. Thanksgiving will be here in a few weeks. It's hard for me to wrap my head around that. But enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your weather, fall weather, wherever you are. And we'll be back Monday with more Techstrong, gang.